In 1976, David Bowie was coming off the release of a number of very successful albums: Station to Station, Young Americans, and Diamond Dogs. These albums all performed really well, and each had seen a large amount of innovation, covering genres including glam rock, soul, and funk. David had recently moved away from LA to try and kick his drug problem, and found himself working in Europe with a number of very creative individuals, including self-proclaimed non-musician Brian Eno. In this environment, he pioneered an album that not only broke the conventions of what was expected from his work, but also what was expected from popular music as a whole. Low broke the rules of popular music. It contained disjointed and manic electronic songs on the A-side, with depressive and introspective instrumental pieces covering the B-side. This work was his crowning achievement, and was created by systematically breaking down conventions and writing music that just flew in the face of what people considered to be good music design. We live in a world where most people, both creators and consumers, are obsessed with making products and art that have good design. More so than in many other mediums, computer games seem to have generated an expectation that, in order to be a good game, they must have the conventions that are popular at the time. When I say this, I'm not necessarily talking about the themes or the setting, although they are a component, but rather the way the game plays. Across the board, including both AAA and popular indie titles, there is a trend to follow the rules of how a game must be created, controlled, and played. This can range from obvious control systems, such as most third-person games using a scheme that is derived from Resident Evil 4, to far more minute aspects, such as input buffering and response times. Every generation of computer games tends to have some sort of design trend that has become standard. This can often take the form of game genres, such as platformers being popular on the Nintendo Entertainment System, or Call of Duty clones being popular towards the end of the Xbox 360's lifespan. Games seem to be consistently refining what constitutes good design, and any game that steps away from this trend tends to be shunned. You can even see this when people look back at old games. Online communities are oddly clamoring for remakes of games that are less than 10 years old, and that are still available due to minute differences in control between what was popular then and now. For instance, there's a huge movement for a remake of Demon's Souls with updated controls that match that of Dark Souls 3, and a stripped away world tendency mechanic, simply because these features aren't considered good design. Aside from being ported over to other systems, a game like Demon's Souls would only lose its soul if it were to be remade with current design trends in mind. I find it particularly ironic, as Demon's Souls was built upon the idea of subverting expectations. 10 years ago, good game design would say that a game should not get harder if the player gets killed. Good game design says that a player should not be set back a great distance if they die at the boss. Good game design says that you can't have other players kill you in a primarily single-player experience. Bennett Foddy of QWOP and Getting Over It with Bennett Foddy fame has discussed this aspect quite a bit recently. On a recent roundtable podcast, he explains.
Think of this as anti-design. I think anti-design is one of the kind of coolest, hottest things that's happening in games right now. Because we had since like 2008, or 2005, I guess, Cave Story. I'm going to say since Cave Story, we've had in sort of, at least in indie games, but I think just in games generally, this sort of focus on good design. Meaning good design is a game that you can instantly understand how to play, or you can learn how to play just by playing it. You don't have to read a manual. It's very smooth. There's no frustration. Everything's completely in your control the whole time, even if it's difficult, right? And the difficulty ramp is perfectly correct. Right, I don't want to give up on good design. I like those games. I think it's good that we continue to figure out what the tricks of the trade are and what the orthodoxy should be. Mm-hmm. But we're also going to miss some things that way, right? We're going to miss some ideas that you can't have if you, like, so example would be, I've been talking to my friends recently about platformers. The orthodoxy now is that jumping is slightly buffered, meaning that if you start to press jump just before you land, you'll jump again. Mm-hmm. But it's like 2 or 3 frames usually for a modern platform game. It's almost across the board, that's the rule. There's no modern platformer where there's no buffering, where you have to jump after you hit the ground, which was how it was, of course, back in the 80s and 90s, mostly. And there's no game where you can buffer your jump like right at the beginning of your previous jump, which is the case in some games. I think like Prince of Persia 2008 would be a recent example. Dark Castle back on the original Macintosh would be an example. And it's just fine. I mean, maybe that is the best rule, but you might have all kinds of games that you can get out of doing it the other way. Mm-hmm. Flavors, different flavors. And I think you should be able to cook with all flavors. So I'm happy for people to still have a sense of what good design is, but it's really refreshing to play some games that are badly designed in interesting ways.
Foddy's assertion that games tend to be obsessed with good design hits the nail right on the head. However, I would go one step further and suggest that the audience of these games are a large part of what makes everything so focused on good design. When Foddy talks about anti-design in games, he is mostly referring to smaller products, such as his own Getting Over It or Rain World. Getting Over It is a very extreme example of anti-design that somehow managed to get mainstream success. And this is a great case to show how disregarding design trends can make great games. Getting Over It plays almost like nothing else on the market, and the entire game uses only mouse movements for control, not even featuring mouse clicks. Using any other control method would result in the game being fundamentally different. However, other elements of Getting Over It are rooted in current design trends. Hard games with punishing mechanics are once again popular, and games where a progression comes from the player getting better at the mechanics, rather than from upgrades, are also back in vogue. Getting Over It both outright rejects, but also strangely conforms to, current design trends. Foddy's earlier games exhibit a large amount of anti-design as well. QWOP is perhaps his most famous work due to both the absurdism that the game has, but also the infuriating level of challenge that it provides. Nothing about QWOP is good design, but the same way, the game still makes a compelling experience that has left its mark on the internet. Foddy has expressed that he is interested in the frustration that players can experience when playing games, rather than creating orthodox levels of fun. Games that are traditionally hard tend to focus more on satisfaction that the player gets from overcoming obstacles, while Foddy's games seem to treat this emotion as more of a byproduct rather than a desired result. QWOP, GURP, and especially QWOP weren't necessarily designed to be beaten. They were designed to be what Foddy calls a real challenge. One that the player doesn't know whether or not they're actually going to be able to beat. Again, this flies in the face of good design, and as such, creates a really unique experience. Taking this idea to less extreme lengths, a focus on good design can still exclude a certain artistic and experimental goals from being fulfilled in games. The current official narrative of video game development says that most of the game design decisions that were made in the early 3D action games were necessary mistakes that paved the way to our current way of doing things. I disagree with this assertion. In some cases, controls were clunky or amateurish. However, an excellent example of where I believe this not to be the case is in the classic style of Resident Evil games. Tank controls are the go-to for describing how the way we control a character has improved over the years. It is often brought up when talking about current VR games as a means of arguing that the current VR market will eventually find its feet. The big problem with this line of thought is that it outright ignores the design decisions that led to the implementation of tank controls. Unlike VR teleporting and other unwieldy VR control methods, Resident Evil uses tank controls to convey fear, confusion, and encourage a certain type of gameplay. Resident Evil is not an action game. It's a game about creating tension through gameplay systems. Offensive options are designed to be limited, and, especially in the remake, ineffective in the long term. The player has to juggle around limited resources and a small inventory space. The tank controls discourage combat, and encourages a frantic escape and enemy avoidance, which all adds to the tension of the experience. In Remake, you can really see how important the system is to the entire design of the game by using the alternative controls. The alternative control scheme allows the players to easily run circles around enemies and use cheap tactics to win encounters while expending little resources. The player feels far safer than the original game design was intended when using these alternative controls. Flipping back to the original tank controls, and the game suddenly works as intended again. Without this bad design that is tank controls, the original Resident Evil doesn't achieve its goals. Moving on to another example, the original version of Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater shipped with a camera that was antithetical to the gameplay of that game. Unlike Resident Evil, MGS3 does not greatly benefit from concealing information from the player. The stealth gameplay present in the game was not consistent with the directed camera angles. This is clearly an example of when bad design really is bad design. It's so bad that it triggered an entire re-release of the game with a third-person over-the-shoulder camera. The third-person camera essentially fixed the gameplay. Players could now see guards before being spotted, and could effectively observe their surroundings. It was almost as if this was the way the game was originally meant to be played. Again, MGS3 is a game that seems to have a group of fans that, for some reason, are clamoring for a remake because they see the gameplay as being outdated. The prevalent theme behind the request for a Fox Engine remaster of MGS3 appears to be to do with two things predominantly: the graphics and the controls. Artistic intention being lost when remaking or remastering game visuals is something that's beyond the scope of this video, but be aware that I draw a clear line between faithful remakes and remasters, such as the MGS HD collection and Resident Evil's remake, and bad ones, such as New and Tasty or the Halo Combat Evolved Anniversary. In short, it's something akin to colorizing black and white films, or re-recording old rock LPs for a reissue. Changing tack back towards the gameplay, I take issue with the idea that MGS3's controls are bad or outdated. The controls are all meticulously crafted to encourage the type of gameplay intended by Koji Pro. The lack of crouch move encourages a slower pace, and the more realistic style of sneaking. Mapping shoot to a face button, and requiring awkward combinations of buttons to be held down for first-person aiming, de-emphasizes gunplay, and encourages the player to use a plethora of more interesting tricks at their disposal when sneaking through the levels. As it stands, MGS3 already has a problem with the silence tranquilizer being overpowered. And without the awkward controls, this problem would overpower the game. The exact issue can clearly be seen in sequels, particularly MGS4 and MGS5. The added ease of aiming that having the shoot button on a trigger results in these games results in a situation where stealth becomes almost trivial. The Phantom Pain, despite many claims of having the best gameplay in the series, is by far the easiest and requires the least amount of tricks to be successful, due to the controls as well as the open level design. Comparing the Phantom Pain to MGS3, you can clearly see that the benefits of intentionally obtuse controls can have to gameplay. As shooting is not the focus, players are able to play the game at a much slower pace and play with all the different creative systems. There's so much to do in this game beyond shooting that it's a godsend that the player doesn't have to just shoot all the way through. MGS3 was both originally hindered by, but also clearly enhanced by, bad design. Now, to bring this all back around, not every game needs to embrace bad or anti-design. There is no problem with games like The Evil Within, Nier Automata, or Call of Duty using iterations of basic design trends. Rather, it's important to remember that breaking design trends is not a bad thing, and even using ones that have lain dormant for years can create experiences that otherwise would be left to the wayside. Without bad design, the classic Spies vs. Mercs mode from the old Splinter Cell games would not exist. Bad design and anti-design are important not only for innovation, but for realizing artistic and stylistic goals. The next time you play a game that you might consider outdated or poorly designed, consider what the developer might have intended for those controls to do for you. Were they designed to make the gameplay harder and increase tension, a la Resident Evil? Were they to encourage a type of gameplay like MGS3 where it's slow, methodical, and wants you to do many different things rather than focus on the easy way to do it? Would the game exist if a different control scheme was used, like Getting Over It? Or was it simply just bad design?